Welcome to Château de Vaux. It's a great 18th century chateau that I took over 10 years ago. And for these 10 years anniversary, we decided to develop a new restoration program, since the chateau has been saved since February last year. All the structural work has been reviewed, and we've now saved the building with its framework and roofs. We're now protected from water and air, which is no mean feat. The chateau had been abandoned for some 80 years, since the Second World War. Now inside, and we're here on the second floor, we're about to embark on a meticulous restoration program, very different from what we've seen before. We're going to take care of the ceilings, the parquet floors, the walls with all the woodwork and fabrics that are going to be restored and brought up to date in the spirit of the 18th century. And so here, we start with this vestibule, which is in fact a room that is the central part of the chateau. What's very elegant here is that we have this natural light no matter what time of day it is. And the chapel here, which was also a billiard room in the 18th century, there's not much left. You see, there are these huge metal IPNs, which made it possible to restore the levels, since they had disappeared with the collapse of the framework. So this is a room we're going to restore. The advantage and disadvantage here is that the interior of the chateau is not listed as a historic monument. So the advantage is that there are no constraints. We choose, with or without an architect, our materials and our teams of craftsmen. There are a lot of them in the region, so it's very exciting. We're on all fours with them all day long. We lay old floors that have been bought from professionals elsewhere, and we try to reconstitute a coherent decor. And as you can see, there's a lot of work to be done over the next 10 years. And we'll be starting in 2026 with the restoration of the ceilings, since you can see here that everything needs to be redone. So here we arrive to the gallery above the first salon on the ground floor, the Grand Salon, and here you have a succession of bedrooms. There's a hallway with 3 doors that leads into former rooms from the 18th century where not much remains, but the discerning eye of the architect or enthusiast will still see that here there are some very rare elements, including this trumo from the Louis XV period. It's a trumo, you might say quite regional, but it's made from exceptional materials, local oak. Everything was originally made on site. We find the counterpart with the supporting woodwork, the doors with their door frames, and the wood panel over door, so it's a fairly simple decor. But finally, once we've completed it, as you can see there is a gap right here in front of me. There was a partition here that we knocked down to raise the level that was collapsing in the large living room below. So now that we've solved these structural problems, we're really tackling the aesthetic part, which is very time-consuming, meticulous, even a little perilous. But I think that's the secret of a successful restoration. When people come back to this room, once restored, they must have the impression that nothing has moved since the 18th or at worst, the 19th century. So here, we're going to restore all this woodwork with the models you have there, the Louis XVI period fireplace, which is not marble, contrary to appearances, which is in stone, and which was painted in faux marble at the end of the 18th. So here it's the same, we keep it. Anything that has a soul, anything that has an existence or anteriority, we'll try to preserve it and bring it to the fore. Here we are in the antechamber of this large apartment. And in the 18th century, Vaux was endowed with this apartment on the second floor to receive guests. The family lived on the ground floor, so there were 4 large rooms overlooking the park and overlooking the courtyard where guests were accommodated. And here was the servant's bedroom. On the 18th plans, you can see a smaller room adjoining the large one, and the location of the bed on which the servant sat. He was in charge of the luggages, etc. It's a time when we had crews, we had a car that followed the travels with a household staff, and we had to accommodate all this little world there. So imagine this room in much the same condition as the adjoining bedroom. There's a remnant of a fireplace over mantel here from the Louis XVI period, with its old mercury mirror. It's very damaged, but with careful removal and a talented craftsman, which our cabinet maker is, we'll be able to redo it identically, keeping the original elements. Here you have a wood structure that was filled with stones, which we removed about 2 years ago because of the structural problem. The load was actually coming down and the partition was no longer held, so we simply attached it with metal ties. Now we come to the service areas, which I think, here as elsewhere, are really part of the soul of a historic house. Here we had the linen cupboards, which we've partly dismantled, but which we're going to reassemble. These little partitions were made in the 19th century, but which testify a little to the life of these large estates, where there were servants after all who looked after the upkeep of the house, remaking the beds, putting wood up the fireplaces, and we had these little passageways. You see this in lots of beautiful places, mansions in particular. It's part of the authenticity of the place. We had the option of demolishing them, since they post-date the construction of the chateau, but I absolutely wanted to preserve them and highlight them with these old doors. And then we come to another room, which I'll show you. Once you've passed through these cramped corridors, where the chateau and household staff lived, and here we come again to another room, which is smaller than it was originally, since this wall was added in the 19th century. As I told you just before, we decided to keep this wall, since the 18th elements, so all this woodwork and door frames were simply brought forward to reduce the size of the room and create an apartment for the servants. So we'll keep that. Here on the floor, you have construction site panels at this level. We've raised the entire walkable floor. We recreated the IPNs and oak beams to rebuild this level, which was underpinned. For those of you who don't know Vaux, it used to be a forest of props just a few months ago, and we had structures, what we call wooden props, which held the load of the framework that was literally collapsing from the inside. So there, on 3 levels, we had temporary structures that have now been dismantled. As you can see, the ceiling needs a lot of work. But the structure is in good condition, having been overhauled by a carpenter for years, and the job is now done. So now we're already thinking about the finish, and it's this wonderful Versailles parquet, which is period 18th century, which is very hard to find, at least at a reasonable price since there are a lot of people offering it, but it's often around 400 euros per square meter. In this case, we bought it much more cheaply, as it was for a demolition site in a more distant region, and we were offered it, given that people knew the chateau, we were offered not to make a donation, but to pay an extremely low price for the chateau and its restoration. So this parquet floor, it's 17 square meters, it's 27 square meters, sorry. It's exactly the size of the room, and with this 27 square meter lot, we looked for one of the chateau's 40 rooms, where to put the whole lot so as not to dissociate it or cobble it together, so to speak. So here, we'll be able to install it identically, and the room is exactly 26 or 50 square meters, so it's perfect. And here you can see that the fireplace has been stolen. Like many other elements of interior architecture, the fireplace was taken to other places, because at the time the family owned lots of castles and different homes. Unfortunately, the chateau was falling into ruin at the dawn of the Second World War, so they decided to take some of the materials and move them. But we're going to put one back, a fireplace, and we've still got this overmantel that's almost in pieces, held together by the operation of the Holy Spirit, but we're going to try to put it down gently and rebuild it. That's it. So, once again, there's an enormous amount of work to be done, as you can see here. But despite all this work, we still have vestiges that will enable us to carry out a restoration. It's not a do-it-yourself project, but rather a faithful restoration of existing elements. There's a second antechamber here, and a third and final bedroom in the right wing. It's interesting because you can see all the phases of construction and restoration. The old cob and half-timbered walls, which really date back to the construction, to the 18th century. Stuffed with stones in those days, we didn't look at the expense, but we didn't make a calculation note either to see if it wasn't going to sag. The old-timers did great work, but sometimes they didn't bother with calculations. So they filled the whole thing with stones, and what we did was we hollowed out the areas that were really sick. We hollowed out these stones to lighten the structures and restore the original level. So in this case, it wasn't necessary. You can really see the primary layer. Then you can see the cob made with goat's hair, sheep's wool, and lime plaster. It served as insulation and binder. And on top of that, you'll find a kind of very fine jute canvas, which served as a kind of underlay for the upholsterer. Lastly, the tapestry. This is a tapestry, a wall hanging, from the first half of the 19th century, which is in tatters. It's going to be very complicated to restore. I won't draw you a picture, it's very, very damaged. But here, we can eventually draw inspiration from the floral motif that we'll be seeing more behind. And this floral motif can either be photographed and with a print, restoring the original decor, or it can be inspired by something existing and relatively close to it. Once again, we always try to be consistent with what already exists. And here we have all the woodwork and the fireplace. Here you have a very nice view. We're in a small antechamber that leads to a bathroom. So a very nice view on the central body with its statues and what we call the acroterion, which is in fact the half moon, which sets off the architecture of Vaux. And this is a feat of engineering for its time, since the distribution of the load of stones is very skillful indeed and clever for the time. Here we'll find something quite original that was purchased only 3 years ago. It was bought from a neighbor who heard about the work on the chateau, contacted us and said, I have a bathtub in my family home, a zinc bathtub dating from the 19th century, and this bathtub was sold by the last occupants of the chateau to this gentleman's grandmother. And so he showed me the deed of sale, which dates from 1937, in which Madame de Fontenay sold the chateau's bathtub just before leaving the estate for good, unfortunately. So it's a bathtub in faux marble, which is very beautiful. It's a green marble, and it had a heating system. It was very modern for its time, with a stove that provided hot water. So here again we find this gallery with all the doors, a succession of original doors and door frames in oak. This is all from the 18th century. And we're going to start again from this decor to fill in all these walls that we had to empty, because they were filled with stones, and inevitably this load weighed considerably on the level, which is an empty level, because we used to be, and we're going to go back to it, in the large living room on the ground floor. And you'll see that in fact there's an extremely long span, and the load was far too heavy to support all that. So we're back in the central section. Here you have the beautiful 18th century staircase, which is the only part of the chateau inside that is listed as a historic monument. Further up, you have this marvelous ceiling, which was redone as part of the renovation, even though it wasn't part of the plan, because there were only the structures. But here we had a scaffold that cost around $30,000 to rent. And 10 days before taking it down, I absolutely had to take advantage of it to replicate the decor, which was really in tatters. And we put it back together with a staffer, and we took care of the painting, so we don't have to go back into this part, which is very difficult to access. So here, we extend this large gallery on the second floor, which is the width of the chateau. So it's about 60 meters long, and we come to a small area that will be the part I already live in behind this modern partition. But eventually, the private part will extend a little beyond with this door. And now I'd like to introduce you to the 2 future bedrooms. Here we have the 6th and penultimate bedroom, a room that has retained all its volume. Here, once again, there were props holding the ceilings in place, and if you look up, you'll see the original joists, and the yellow joists, which are obviously new, but made of oak by talented carpenters, Compagnons du Devoir, who did a remarkable job. So from here, the staffer arrives by next year, and he's going to plaster all these ceilings with plaster that's been ruined by hand. And then we're restoring all the modillions and little gypseries, so we can have an 18th century ceiling. The largest and most beautiful room in the chateau, which is therefore on the 2nd floor. So an 18th century room, which apart from its parquet floor, which was stolen, a Versailles parquet floor, has retained all its original features. And I'll explain why. First, the ceiling has not been altered or restored since the late 18th. There are some very pretty floral element and shell friezes. This was done in the 18th century. And here we find above all a fabric and wallpaper. So a fabric from the 20th century in the years 1900-1910, since we actually have the invoice in the archives for this fabric. And the advantage of this fabric is that it was able to protect over the long term, during the chateau's abandonment, this very, very beautiful wallpaper, which is from the first third of the 19th century. And here we have almost all of this wallpaper. And now we're going to be able to put it back together, restore it, and the few rare places where it's missing, we'll then be able to re-edit the wallpaper. And of course, needless to say, we'll have a very faithful rendering of what this room looked like 80 years ago, before the Second World War. The woodwork is intact, the fireplace is in place, the overmantel is here, just the mirror is missing, and there's a parquet floor missing. So there's a bit of work to do. You're going to say I'm very optimistic, but when I see a room like this that's finally free of its props, we've got the whole decor, And now we've got some painstaking reconstruction work ahead of us, but it's going to be fascinating because it's going to be extremely visual. That's it. The tour of the second floor is over. As you can see, we still have a lot of work to do, and we'll be starting next year. For the time being, I'm going to take you through the 5 rooms on the ground floor, which are much larger. The sets are impressive, and we're currently working on the last room, which will be completed shortly. Here we are, back on the ground floor of the house, the large vestibule we restored 5 years ago. This was the first room we did. At the time, Chateau filmed the before and after, which were quite impressive. But now we've reached the grand salon, which is the emblematic room of the entire house, since it was always here that guests were received. And all this in a certain order, since we arrived from the vestibule to the summer salon, which we'll see next. And then finally to the grand salon, where the family generally spent most of their time. So we put back some elements you see here quite lively. We have a harp from the late 19th century that was bought this year in an auction. What were we doing in a grand salon in those days in the 19th century? We played a bit of music. We have an old Erard piano too, which was bought back. We played cards. We kept up conversations, readings. And in the end, it was a very pleasant room, which allowed the whole family, at least in the 19th century. But I think in the 18th it was the same, to spend most of its time when we weren't out and about. This room really reflects the mood of a house. And what we wanted to do here was to give Vaux back a little of the atmosphere of a big house in the countryside. And this big house in the country, well, we were inspired by the green colors that you see on the 3 windows facing the park. So there's the omnipresence of the forest, the meadow. We even had sheep the first few years I was here. So there you have it, a bit of the atmosphere and tone of a country house like you'd find in England. It's important to know that we started work on this room about 2 years ago. At the same time as we were doing the structural work, we took care of the ceiling. So now a staffer has removed all the original moldings. There were still a few left, and using an elastomer mold, he duplicated them ad infinitum to fill in all the decoration that had been totally ruined. I think you'll see some of the photos in this video. It's completely incredible. It's a titanic undertaking. So I supervised the work, not me with my little hands. Even though I'm quite handy, I supervised the work without the help of an architect, but with total agreement and friendship with all these teams of craftsmen, who understood exactly what I wanted, with antique elements. So here you have the original fireplace, which was stolen in the 60s and found in another country. It was brought back here under seal. And when I bought the chateau, I was told, you're going to find one of the castle's fireplaces. And it turns out to be the most important one, the one in the grand salon. Thanks to the sill, we were able to locate it. We put it back. Above here, you have a trumo from the 19th period, which was bought at a flea market in Paris. But the advantage is that we found a pair that respond to each other, and we adapted them. So we were able to start from scratch, a restoration with 2 old elements. And from there, here, we set about creating a woodwork decor based on the model of the 18th salon next door, which is the small music salon. And so we redid the upper part in plaster. So it doesn't show because it's painted. We even made fake cracks, as if the wood panels were separating. And the lower part is oak. The upper part is plaster. The doors respect the model we have here in the 18th century. Again, with a trace of origin. We made an exact copy. An artisan helped us recreate the small door hinges just like they were originally. And these are all talented craftsmen working in the Aube region. We're in Champagne. Aube is not a well-known department, but I can tell you that in Troyes and in all the small towns around this department, there are still people working in remarkable ways. And we need to encourage them. We need to put them to work. For us, it's an opportunity. But I think these are jobs that are disappearing. And thanks to them, we've been able to do wonderful things. So here you have the counter heart of the room with this rose window, which is really from the first half of the 18th century, and which was, of course, revisited under Napoleon III, since the chateau was owned by a minister of Napoleon III. So this chandelier is from the Napoleon III period. We bought it from a chateau, which unfortunately was for sale in pieces. and we integrated it into the decor as if it had always been there. Now we're going to take a look at the project of this year, which is the summer salon, the future billiard room, right next door. So why the summer salon? Because it's an extremely bright room overlooking the south-facing park. What makes this chateau special is that when you're greeted, it's very cold, very solemn, because we're facing due north. And there's this very high mass of stone that greets you. And here we enter a warmer space where we had nothing at all. The levels had collapsed from the cellar to the attic. This was the backbone of the chateau, stretching over 4 floors, which started in the cellar and went up to the frameworks with temporary wooden structures. And so there we are, all of us in the family. And my parents, my friends, my brothers and sisters gave me a lot of advice when I bought Vaux. And they all said to me when they saw this room, you're going to face a very big problem here, because you don't even know if you're going to be able to save the central part. And in fact, we succeeded. We started the structural work 6 years ago with this element. And imagine that it was in a void 20 meters above your head and 6 meters below your feet. So now that it's finished, we set about this ambitious restoration, which, unlike the Grand Salon, is going to be very expensive. The Grand Salon wasn't a gift, it cost 100,000 euros. With 100,000 euros, we redid the woodwork and all the ceilings I explained to you, but there were still some original elements, the volumes hadn't collapsed. This time we've redone everything, and the budget for the work is more than 150,000 euros. For this price, you don't put in a piece of furniture, you don't paint. It's just what you see on the walls, ceiling and floor. And we're in the middle of what we might call the transitional phase of the project, since we're in the process of positioning the woodwork. And we've just finished laying of this beautiful 18th century cabochon paving, which was bought back, of course. It was all gone. So it's an extremely expensive job. I'll tell you a little more about it. But above all, you need to know that there's been no help from the state, since the chateau's interior hasn't been classified or listed as a historic monument. Only the exterior facades and roofs, where we have benefited from generous grants from the state, but also from the Grand East region. And without it, we wouldn't have been able to carry out such a successful project. So that's 3 million euros worth of work. We received significant and necessary support, without which we wouldn't have been able to undertake these renovations. But here it's important to remember that we finance everything with visitors' money, with the running of the estate, events, weddings and visits. That's it. And we also have 10% of the annual budget for these interior works, so the equivalent of 15 or 20,000 euros, which is in the form of donations. And it's the Fondation du Patrimoine that helps us fill this budget, because it offers donors the opportunity to deduct part of their donations from their income tax. So that obviously motivates a lot of people. And every year, we have loyal supporters. We have a gentleman who belongs to the former owner's family, who gives a small sum of money every year, but on a very regular basis, and there are many others like him. This allows us to make ends meet. So we haven't finished the work yet. We'll see what happens next. That'll be next winter when we finish work on the ground floor. This fireplace has been put back in its original place, but it was bought in the east of France in an apartment. We don't know what it was doing there, but it was bought on the website called Lebencoin for a rather derisory sum, and it seems to have always been there. We put back the original plaque, a plaque with the coat of arms of France, which was found in the cellar since everything had collapsed. One day, my little brother Louis came here and said, "There's a triangular shape on the bottom of the fireplace." And in fact, we found the same shape on a slab 6 feet below us. Here you have wood paneling from the first half of the 18th century. While these are copies from the 19th, they are still antique woodwork. And then we bought this lot from an antique dealer who had a quite exceptional lot, which was about 18 linear meters, about 4 meters high. You can see the ceilings are 4 meters high. So we're 50 centimeters short. He's coming over this afternoon, and we're going to decide how we're going to complete the restoration, since we don't want it to show, so that you can see that it's not finished. Either we'll make an extension of the woodwork to bring the decor up to the top, which is desirable, or we'll make a, how shall I put this? We'll fill in the top with smooth wood panels and a large cornice. So there are 2 options, and that's what's so exciting about this job, is that it's not just about running the site, it's not just about welcoming visitors, which is extremely pleasant. There's also the whole winter phase when you're restoring a chateau and redesigning and redecorating volumes that have been completely neglected. So there are options to be taken. Sometimes it's a bit complicated. We get our brains in knots because We go and look at other chateaux, other examples to make sure we don't make any mistakes. But why? Because in the 18th century, there were great basic principles. And you realize that from one chateau to another, in fact, the original elements are laid out in a certain way, and there's no chance. So you can't reinterpret these codes, which are really immutable codes of the decorative arts and interiors of the Ancien Régime. So we try to make as few mistakes as possible. Because here we're not supervised by government departments. We're not supervised by an architect. It's up to me to decide all this with the craftsmen. So we exchange ideas, sometimes we adapt, and that's it. It makes for a few stormy site meetings, but that's all part of the life of an estate that's being restored today. Now, I'll take you through the next room. We also redid the cabochon paving. There were parquet floorboards here, so it was very poor. It was a decor that had retained, we'll say, its 20th century cachet. There wasn't much left, so we decided to remove this parquet floor, which was very simple, and to put back a paving like it was in the 18th century, i.e. a small paving with cabochons, smaller than the one in the living room. And we're going to stop our restoration this winter here, at this door, which we'll be installing in a few days' time, so that visitors will finally have access to the cellars from inside the chateau. Here's the staircase leading down to the cellars and kitchens. And here the last two rooms, the chateau dining room, there was one in every house. Here it was in this wing, the eastern part of the chateau. It's pretty much the same size as the grand salon, except that there are two fewer windows, but it's a walk-through room. So you have the double exposure, which makes it really pleasant and quite bright. And here we have cabochon paving from the 18th century, which was discovered under cement tiles, and it was in a pretty bad condition. So that's the restoration that lies ahead. You see, there's everything to do. So there's a lot to get rid of. All this is leftover material that we used in the various rooms for the restorations. We're going to make a clean sweep, and we're going to redo it in the same way. Ceiling, walls with wood paneling, and we're removing this floor, which we're going to reinstall identically. And now we've reached the end of the chateau, in the future private area. So this is the part I'll be occupying. But it's going to be done in the same spirit, with the same woodwork and the same codes. Woodwork, fireplace. Missing is the trumo, which was stolen in the 30s. You can see that the middle part at the top is in plaster. The sides are also in plaster because there were hangings. So we're going to reupholster it with fabric. But the central part no longer has an overmantel. So a year ago, we bought a completely exceptional set, which is here, which is a trumo from the transition Louis XV, Louis XVI period. Exceptional subject since it's almost 350 meters high, plus the mantle, which is 1.20 meters high. You do the math, it's 4.70 meters under the ceiling. So that's not something you'd find under a horse's hoof. We had to look for this for a long time, but now we have a stock of these materials. You can also see some wood paneling on the floor. So it's a mess. I'm sorry, but all these elements will find their place. Some are original, and others have been bought out and will be adapted. It's going to take a lot of time, energy, and money. And before concluding this tour, I'll now take you to the other end of the house. For me, this is one of the most successful rooms in the restoration, for the simple reason that we had old elements. The room was completely in ruins, but we had the original woodwork. And these doors, which are a bravura piece of work, because they're completely in their original state. We kept the paint chips, we kept the old ironwork, so maybe one day there'll be a restoration to fill in the big gaps. But honestly, I'm not looking forward to it just yet. Firstly, because it's part of the authentic character of a 300-year-old chateau, and also because I don't have unlimited budget. And if a 300-year-old chateau is too frequently repainted, polished and waxed, well, in the end, the visitor who comes to discover it doesn't necessarily get the cachet he's expecting. Then there are people who are more manic than others, who expect things to be spotless. Here we're dealing with a room that's in its original state, that hasn't changed, but in fact it's undergone a huge amount of work, since these wall hangings, you see, is a photo printed on a modern fabric. And thanks to this photo, we've preserved all the patina of the original fabric, which was damaged and had mildew stains and so on. Without going as far as a movie set, we're looking at something that truly holds up. And in a restoration, achieving that illusion is the greatest reward for an owner, because visitors genuinely wonder, is this decor recent or has it remained untouched over time? And here, well, the goal is for people to say, it's never been moved. But there you go. So the room, obviously, we redid the ceiling. There were props. It was all falling apart. So we redid the overmantel. The top part had disappeared. And we had a very talented decor painter who gave us this patina juice where you can no longer see any difference. But the cornice is new on the trumo. And the rest of the boiserie is far from new because the paint is 300 years old. There are no layers of paint below the one you can see, which shows that this really is the original paint, which is absolutely rare. A 19th century fireplace in copy of a Louis XVI period model. This is a classic marble fireplace, but with a completely original format, which we kept and did not change, and it's in its original place. Here's another plaque I bought on an online antiques site. It's a plaque with the arms of one of the families who owned the chateau in the 18th century. So it's nice to think that we're bringing back a bit of life, we're bringing back coherent things. It's quite a motley collection. Some decorative arts professionals would say it's a bit of everything and nothing in this room. But then, it was also the life of a chateau from the 18th century to the present day. A table from the Napoleon III era, a showcase from the Regency period, and the list goes on. Here we have a small commode tombeau that's really lovely, very early 18th century, a bergère from the Louis XVI period, still in its original condition, and absolutely beautiful, but it's very fragile. But there are lots of objects, and that's what a chateau was all about. We traveled, we brought back taxidermy, we brought back curiosities that we may or may not have put in the house. There's a game table here that was donated by a neighbor of the chateau. So there you have it. There are also some very generous visitors who donate a piece of furniture, an object, or a family memento. And that makes for a very pleasant visit. And so, in these settings, you'll find from May 1st an immersive tour. You'll visit 25 furnished rooms, restored from the cellar to the attic of the chateau, and especially in the outbuildings, where we have the stables, the tack room, the coachman's apartment. And all these rooms, in fact, we've brought back things that are coherent with the original decor. And finally, you walk from room to room, and each time you have to find a clue hidden in the room. So it's a tour that's interactive, that appeals to young people, that's immersive, that's a little, I'm not going to say dark, but a little addictive, since it involves solving an investigation set during the reign of Napoleon III, when Vidocq's last boss was the owner of the chateau, Minister Maupas. And so there's an audio tape that you listen to along the 3 kilometers of Grande Allée. It's unique in France. There's this long driveway in front of the chateau that takes you right up to the courtyard. And as you drive up in your car, your cell phone is connected to the car. And there's a narration tape that explains to you, in the voice of an actor, interpreting Vidocq, what you need to find, what you need to do. And then you spend 2 hours immersed in these settings, allowed to do lots of things, touch objects, as long as you bring back the clue. And at the end, you get out of the last locked room. And that's it. And there'll be a bomb to diffuse in that last room, along with music and recorded sounds. So it's really very immersive. And to illustrate, here we have a small desk, and we have a cover that was bought at an auction, which is in the name of Monsieur de Maupas, who was the owner and Minister of Police at the time. Here again, our best friends here at the chateau, you'll find them everywhere. So these are the wooden props. This one is of major importance. In this room, you'll find antique elements. So for us, owners of a chateau, it's a real stroke of luck. Here we are at the back of the building, on the park side. Here is the enfilade. From the vestibule, we pass into the summer salon. Here, there are a few remnants. You just need a keen eye to spot them.